Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's interview, I interview Faith Neese. Faith is a mental health counselor, marriage and family therapist, and a certified sex addiction therapist. She holds a practice in Boca Raton focused on treating trauma, addictive disorders, and family of origin issues. She is trained in emotionally focused therapy, inner child therapy, and experiential-based practices such as psychodrama and somatic processing. Using carefully structured techniques, Faith guides others to resolving their core wounds so they are free to have meaningful and fulfilling relationships with both themselves and others. So without further ado, here's my interview with Faith.
The idea of those exiled parts and how we collude to maintain our clients' exiled parts because it threatens our own exiled parts, and the job of and I think that's what's going on in the mental health community a lot is this there needs to be more rigor and therapists doing their own work because we're so human, and I think the human element is such the healing dynamic. Yeah, I could keep going about this.
That's great. Well, I actually started recording, so we can just roll into the interview if that works. The first question, I want to track back to that person of the therapist work, but the first question I like to ask guests is, how do you view change? What does it take for someone to change? What does it take for change to happen in relational systems and internal systems?
Yeah. So I always go back to that first order versus second order of change model. I think there's a lot, it's a simple idea, but it's a complex one if you start to break it down, because I think first order change being about changing my behavior, whereas second order change being about changing the deeper beliefs or root reasons for the behavior. And if I don't change the core, then the external is not going to shift, So I can keep trying to change the external behaviors, but if I'm not changing the core behaviors, then I'm not going to see results. And I think that happens also in family systems or relational systems, is getting down to the root cause for the behaviors. And they talk about this in conscious discipline, which is a parenting model, that all behavior is communication from your children, but adults are the same way. All of our behavior is communicating something. Yeah. And so if we try to quiet the behavior without addressing the reason for the behavior, we don't see long-lasting change. Yeah. I think change also comes with safety and connection. We don't grow and heal in a vacuum. I really believe that. And if I'm not going to be motivated to change without a safe, secure, nurturing person that's going to hold me through that process, whether hold me physically, emotionally, psychologically, in that change process.
Yeah. And what do you do? What do you suggest for your clients? What do you suggest for other therapists to do to create that safety in relationships? There may be a tie to what you were talking about earlier with the person of the therapist work.
Yeah. The first thing I think of is emotional attunement, which is a loaded clinical word, but the ability to appropriately attune to the feelings that the client might be having, even if they don't know they're having it, which requires our own insight into our emotional landscape and sensation, what sensations mean what emotions, what tension in my body means things about being in front of a client. I think creating safety is being tuned in enough to be able to mirror back to the client what we're feeling so that they understand what they're feeling. And there becomes this feedback. I think of it in a lot of visual ways. It's like there's this infinity loop of energy between the therapist and the client when we're in that flow zone of connection. And I don't think you can replace the feeling of safety that creates because of the need to be seen and properly attuned to in order to create safety and change. There's also, of course, boundaries and setting up proper expectations and appropriate reflection, those types of things. But the biggest one is that emotional attunement and that does come into how do I attune to myself? How do I know my own nervous system reactions to what a client's saying and what that means? And if I feel tingly, or if I feel short of breath, or if I feel really expansive, or if I'm feeling contracting, like what's going on for me, so that I can then see what is it that's going on for the client. So it takes the ability to have that macro perspective as a therapist, as well as the micro perspective of what the client's saying. So I think we're always bouncing between the like looking at it from a thousand foot viewpoint, looking at the big situation, and then also still trying to sit in the chair and be face to face with the client and manage the things that they're saying in the present moment.
Yeah, that's good. And I love that image you gave of that infinity loop and that feedback process, and, matching, the person across new body language and emotion, and, attuning to that, as well as the content. And you specialize in working with sex addiction, and I'd be interested in talking to you a bit about that. I know I had Doug Brown Harvey on the podcast, and he talks about out of control sexual behavior. I'd be interested to hear more from your perspective. At what point, because sex and food, for example, are different than alcohol. Let's say, they're more of like this intrinsic need, these needs that we have, and at what point with sex does it become an addiction? And I guess that'd be the first question. I'd also be interested in why that language makes sense to you versus, Doug's out of control sexual behavior.
Yeah. So I think I value the different perspectives. For me, sex addiction doesn't apply for everyone who's having problematic sexual behavior, or even problematic, or like you said, the out of control sexual behavior that Doug talks about. It's sex addiction crosses into a realm of dependency in order to be able to regulate or feel okay in somebody's skin, just to put it so simply. It's the need for something outside of me to make me feel like I'm okay. And as humans, we always have that. Food and sex in particular are, like you were saying, a biological need. There's nothing wrong with wanting to eat. There's nothing wrong with being attracted to somebody or wanting to have sex with someone. There's nothing wrong with wanting love, nurturing. These are all innate needs, and there's nothing shameful or wrong with them. It crosses into addiction when I'm using those things to mask emotions or trauma or unresolved pain, and to avoid my emotions. So I talk to clients a lot, and therapists about this, that sex addiction or love addiction is intimacy avoidance. And so there's a difference between I'm out of control of my sexual behavior, but I'm still able to achieve intimate connection with someone or a partner. I might struggle with that more because of the shame or the compulsive behavior. But with sex addiction, it's I'm unable, or it's too painful or scary or far from my insight or awareness of how to manifest intimacy. And that intimacy deficit is what I'm looking for more in diagnosing addiction. There's also the standard criteria of increased tolerance, the need for more in order to achieve a desired result, consequences in their daily lives, affecting a relationship. I mean, these are the standards for which we look at addictive disorders, even though it's different than substance abuse, that matches in sex addiction. So I tell clients, like, if a client doesn't have sex addiction, I'm so happy for them. I don't want my client to be a sex addict. Not that there's anything wrong with being a sex addict, but my goal as a CSAT is not to find and prove that everybody's a sex addict. It's to accurately diagnose sex addiction so that it doesn't go untreated and ultimately kill the people who are experiencing it, because there are very high suicide rates in untreated sex and love addiction. So, yeah.
Well, that's helpful. That brings a lot of clarity to distinguishing sex addiction and it being getting in the way of intimacy, a way of coping, a way to feel okay, coping with underlying trauma. And it seems like at a point too, it starts to take on a life of its own, the addiction, and kind of spirals.
Yeah, I think there's a highly compartmentalized face of addiction. I feel like I'm a completely different person when my addict is present. It's not. It feels like something has taken over me, and it does. It takes over people's lives, and it's very confusing because it's not logical. It doesn't fit with my morals or my values, and it's not this moral dilemma. It's these behaviors that I feel I have to do in order to cope. And addiction a lot of times is about either intensifying an experience or numbing an experience. And so when I'm driven to either intensify or numb, I need more and more in order to create that nervous system regulation.
And what do you I mean, this a big question, but kind of a zoomed out look. Like, what do you find to be most effective for treating sex addiction in particular?
Yeah, I think there's many things that go into treating it. One, a therapist who understands the nuanced nature of treating an intimacy avoidance or an intimacy disorder that like sex or love addiction and understands multiple addictive behaviors because typically sex addiction doesn't just manifest without other addictive behaviors going on. It has the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. And our sexuality is very core to the spirit of who we are as a person. And typically we see people acting out in behaviors similar to their sex addiction in other areas. Either it's numbing out with video games or food or work, substances. So somebody who understands multiple addictions and what to treat first, because it's like if don't put the cart before the horse. Sometimes we're not going to get to the sex addiction if there's a substance abuse issue in the way. And first, the person needs to establish sobriety from something else before addressing the sex addiction. Other times, it's appropriate to treat them all at the same time, depending on what's going on. But um, so a therapist who's trained and versed in sexual addiction or love addiction, group support, peer support. I think that the 12-step model has been around for a long time for a reason. And while it has its errors because it's a human program, none of us are perfect. And I think anybody who's been in long-term recovery can say that they've been to a meeting that they didn't feel like was very helpful, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the 12-step program. And that model of 12-step is very supportive for people who want to engage in a recovery process. Utilizing health and wellness, the food, exercise, meditation, breathing, the viewing ourselves as a whole system. I can try and treat myself psychologically, but if I'm continuing to live in a way that my body can't heal, I'm actually kind of facilitating the disease, which lives in shame or secrecy or feeling badly about myself. And we teach our bodies and we teach ourselves that we matter and that we have value by the way we treat ourselves. So engaging in just basics health and self-care, which a therapist and support group can really help guide somebody in doing. And then lastly is if they have the access to therapy groups in addition. So I think that three-legged stool of individual, group, and 12-step is really, it's a foundation for recovery. There's a lot of amazing podcasts and literature, and we live in a time now where we have an access to resources that are amazing for help, but without the basic support system in place, I can read a bunch of books and not feel like I'm really having a recovery program, or I can listen to podcasts, or I can do one of those things and not feel fulfilled.
Yeah, that human connection is so necessary for recovery and for all of us. It's easy in our modern context to get isolated from others. And so you mentioned there you generally will treat a substance use first if it's showing up with sex addiction.
Yeah. I mean, I think starting to educate about sex addiction and give them information about what's going on, that we're seeing co-occurring things, but somebody who's actively drinking or using a substance in a way that's addictive to their mind is not in a place where we can start to really address the sex addiction yet. That's not to say that we encourage them to continue to act out. It's not permission to just like be active in your sex addiction while we treat your drug addiction, but it's very difficult to get somebody's attention and concentration and focus and retention to the recovery material for sex addiction if they're engaging in active drug addiction. So I always say, let's treat that first. If they're in a treatment program, an inpatient treatment program that specializes in both, that's what I'd prefer, because once they're in treatment and abstaining from the use of a substance, then they're ripe for the work. But in an outpatient basis, which is where I work, a private practice outpatient, if somebody has an active drug addiction, then I won't start treating for sex addiction before getting them sober or facilitating their sobriety.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you mentioned health and wellness, and it's an area of passion for me. My wife's a nutritionist, and so I'd be curious to talk a bit more about what as a therapist, you're not a nutritionist, you're not a physician, and so there is some limit to our scope of practice in that realm. But at the same time, I think us therapists often will overlook the importance of exercise, the importance of getting outside into the sun for our circadian rhythms and sleep processes, the importance of nourishing food, stepping away from the foods of industry, the processed foods, the ultra sugary foods. What are some of and you talked about meditation too. Could you just share a bit more about what you generally steer people towards with those?
Yeah, I mean, my personal background, this is where that therapist hat plus my personal hat interacts, because I'm very into health and wellness. I was a weightlifting coach, competitive Olympic weightlifting, and as well as other competitive sports. I grew up as a competitive swimming, and health and wellness has always been a part of my life, and practiced yoga for the better part of 17 years now. So and there's something unparalleled about the experience of finding yourself through physical activity. Like I was saying, the way we communicate to our bodies our worth is the way that we treat ourselves, and this goes back into most of our clients, or most of us coming into a recovery process, are coming because there was probably some lack of nurturing going on as a kid, or wounding events where our needs didn't get met in a proper way. And I talk to clients about this a lot, is that we have to reparent or redevelop how we care for ourselves and what we do. So if I'm using a real life example, if my client's mom never sat down to dinner with them and just had them make instant mac and cheese for themselves at 4, 5, 6, 7, and like there was never this healthy structure around food, the nights when they choose to make a satisfying, nourishing meal for themselves, they're reparenting themselves, or giving them back what they didn't get as a young child. And oftentimes I see clients that struggle in these areas of self-care, whether it be physical self-care, mental self-care, and mental and emotional self-care with meditation or breathing practice, or nutritional self-care. They struggle because they never had anybody model how to care for themselves in that way, and what the importance is of it. So really it becomes on us to re-educate and relearn. And so I do steer clients towards what works for them. I have clients that try all sorts of physical activity. I think doing something is better than doing nothing. The active choice to care for my body in a small way, even if it's 5-10 minutes a day, is still going to give me huge impact. There's research with mindfulness that 5 to 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation a day is all it takes to create long-lasting and profound change, as long as I've done it for a 21-day period. So for 3 weeks, 5 minutes of 3 weeks, I can fundamentally change my brain structure if I'm consistent in these practices. And I think when I'm a science nerd, I think that's also where I get this, like, I really love the science and the neurobiology of it all. And I think the more I've understood that component, the more I see like the body is this whole system. And so I have such easy tools to take care of the system, but it's almost too easy. Like, just have to like not eat processed foods, like take 5 minutes of breathing practice, do a little bit of meditation, walk for 20 minutes. And I understand that for somebody who's doing none of that, for me to say that, it sounds really overwhelming. But once we start those basics, it's so easy to maintain. The thing with addicts that I say a lot, though, is that we're really good at starting things and we're not so good at following through on them, So starting is an asset, and maintenance is where the work really comes in, of being consistent with this, living in a way that's treating my whole self.
Yeah. And with that maintenance piece, there's certainly staying connected to community that you talked about earlier. What are other key pieces you recommend or find are successful for people in terms of maintenance?
Yeah, having an intentional morning routine is a big one, whether that's I'm doing some journaling, I'm writing an affirmation or saying an affirmation in the mirror to myself. Uh, I interchange because for people who don't have a relationship with a higher power or consider themselves atheists, like you can still set an intention or have a goal for yourself for the day, or substituting that with prayer and having a conversation with a higher power, taking some time to stretch or breathe. Just the That's such a big thing with maintenance, and in 12-step recovery they have that 10th step, a daily inventory. So at nighttime, if it's realistic, taking a time to kind of check in with yourself and like, how do I feel about the day? Is there anything left unfinished? Can I appreciate anything about myself or my partner in the day? I have Nighttime, I think, is a really beautiful time for couples that are in recovery to just like touch base and say like, hey, I really appreciated these three things about you today. And when that becomes a routine in a relationship, can be really healing. So
Yeah.
these small touch points in the morning and the evening, go a long way for maintenance. And it's so easy to have life get in the way of those. Our mornings can get rushed, our nights end up late before we know it. So when we're doing a consistent maintenance routine, we're making space for ourselves in a way that helps us continue the healing process and says that we're important
Yeah.
and our recovery is important.
Absolutely. And I love what you were saying earlier too about we're reparenting ourselves through these small acts because yeah, a lot of times folks have experienced lack of that proper parenting growing up, and each of those small steps is a step towards showing that younger part of us who's in pain that you're loved. I care for you.
Yeah. I think it's such a foreign concept. I remember being young in the field and even in my undergraduate program, and the first time ever hearing about inner child work, I was like, oh, that sounds really cheesy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Having this like knee jerk, like, oh, like, and then I had friends, who had done inner child programs that were really beautiful and healing, and they have like a stuffed animal to represent their inner child. And I hadn't done my inner child work yet. So I was like, oh God, this is so weird. Like I can't, so I think it's hard for clients coming in who have never like really gotten in touch with that part. It's really scary to connect and nurture a wounded inner child if you never have before. And it can be really cringy and uncomfortable or just completely foreign. I have clients that are like, I don't know what, because I'll ask in session, like, what age is that? What does that feel like? Or what does that feel similar to? What younger part is showing up in the unmet need in the present? And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. What inner child? There's only me here. And I'm like, well,
Yeah. Yeah.
and when it takes such a shift in perspective of ourselves to then live in a way that I'm caring for my inner child through these small acts. And I have a practice for myself where if I'm doing the dishes, I'm saying to myself, like, I'm treating myself in the way that I deserve by not making myself anxious by having dirty dishes in the house. And I used to avoid the dishes and I would feel all anxious about it. And it's like, why was I really doing that? And that's because my nervous system was used to the anxiety of the chaos of not doing that. And as I realized, I gain insight and awareness about what the reason why I'm doing a behavior. And then I look at what unmet need is there. And then what can I choose to do to meet the unmet need? And it's such a simple quote unquote process that can be hard to do. And once I do that, I can every time reinforce, like, I no longer have to live in an anxious or chaotic state. Like, it's okay to be at peace and soothed, and washing something as simple as putting my dishes in the dishwasher when I'm done with them creates that for me. So
I
it's in
love
the
that.
small
Yeah.
acts. Yeah.
What'd you say?
It's in the small acts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Will you say that process again? It's identifying the need that's not met, meeting the need. What?
Yeah, so the process, first becoming aware of what's the unmet need, what's going on in this, because really what we're talking about is treating trauma repetition. Um, and so I have these patterns that reenact a traumatic event in my life just on the emotional way that I feel in my life. So everything might look different than my traumatic environment as a child, but I still feel the same sensations that I felt, whether that be being on eggshells, being numb, feeling unseen. And what ends up happening is I don't understand why I'm not happy or regulated or feeling okay, or why am I avoiding things that seem like easy tasks. If we really look at the patterns and the behavior, it's because it replicates an unresolved emotion from trauma, a traumatic childhood. And oftentimes if we leave those things untreated, we'll start to need more in order to medicate it, which is where addictive disorders come in. So if I'm a person in recovery and I leave my dishes in the sink long enough, it sounds silly, but it can lead to a relapse. And it's obviously not the dirty dishes that lead to the relapse, but that state of being dysregulated over and over and over again with no way to cope with it can lead to needing my addictive disorders or my unhealthy coping mechanisms in order to treat the dysregulation. So in the process of deeper recovery work and that inner child recovery work is that I start to create the nurturing environment that I didn't get that led to my addictive disorders in the first place. So if I notice these patterns of behavior and I don't understand why I'm deading, I'm shopping, I'm looking at porn on certain patterns of nights. Okay, so let's start to understand what are the feelings that happen before or during while I'm doing those, and what does that feel similar to, so that I can identify what the unmet need in childhood really was. From there, I can choose, okay, what as a capable adult now, a healthy adult now, how do I meet those needs in the present? And I think there's a difference between I just make my bed every day, which that's one of those like treatment standards that I think is such a healthy thing for people. Like if you go to an inpatient treatment center, you come out and you want to make your bed every day because it's such a rigid routine and inpatient. But if I don't understand what it means to me to make my bed every day, then I'm going to drop off and not do it anymore. And this also goes back to the first order versus second order change, is I can change the behavior and make the bed. But if I don't understand the deeper reason behind my behavioral change or what it means to me to change that behavior, it's not going to stick. So once I understand that washing the dishes or making my bed or these types of things is actually creating safety for my inner child, then I can acknowledge to my own inner child while I'm doing those things that, hey, I got you. You don't have to be anxious, or don't worry, like you're allowed to have peace and calm, or your needs are important to me and you don't have to be neglected today. And that intentionality takes it to a deeper level. I think that just behavior change doesn't address. So that's
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing this, Faith. These ideas are new to me and so impactful. I see how impactful, I've heard of this concept of like taking the time to slow down and be with these younger parts of us, all the parts of us, and show them acceptance and ask them what needs aren't being met, and do a visualization in our minds of meeting their needs. And that's been really powerful for me and others. But I've not heard much many people talk about what you're saying of in action taking care of these parts, and it's so beautiful.
Yeah, I think it also gives what I've seen it give clients is a feeling of autonomy and agency over their healing. It doesn't feel like I'm just like, okay, take care of myself in this ambiguous way. It gives this very specific, if I do this, I'm directly meeting this for myself. And it feels so empowering, I think, to know like I have a choice over my care now. And I don't have to. This also goes back to that trauma piece of we feel like we're powerless or we don't have a choice when we're in a traumatic nurturing environment or a non-nurturing environment. And so when we're able to choose how we take care of ourselves today, we're automatically taking ourselves out of that powerlessness or that stuckness that trauma can feel like.
And do you have uh, practices or tips for people to come to more awareness of those unmet needs and to reconnect with those inner children who are in pain and don't have their needs met?
Yeah, I personally, I really like following the PMLD protocol. As far as the PIT work, that's something that I was trained in.
And I'm not
And
familiar. What does that stand for?
yeah, PIT means post-induction therapy, and it's a process through a meditative state of coming back to reclaiming your younger part, as well as giving back carried feelings to caregivers or abusers or disturbing relationships that we may have taken on how they felt instead of having our own reality. So PMLD talks about there being 5 core woundings for a person who grow up in a environment that's less than nurturing. And so it's a wounding to our boundaries, a wounding to our self-esteem, a wounding to our value, a wounding to our limits. Oh, and I'm going to blink, of course, because I'm on the spot. I'm going to
That's
blink.
all right. I do it all the time.
But the spontaneities in there, our reality, these types of things. So what her work is about is coming back to our authentic selves, seeing ourselves as valuable, perfectly imperfect, free to be spontaneous in the moment when that's appropriate, able to have limits and boundaries. And I like her framework a lot. It's a little bit complicated sometimes for some clients, I think, and for some clinicians who learn it. I think if I was brand new as a therapist, I don't know if I'd been exposed to it for a while, I would have taken to it. But brand new out of the gate, it's a lot of concepts, and I think it doesn't. It does leave room for you to find yourself in her model and personalize it, but at the same time, there's a pretty direct process of it. You're not changing or customizing, similar to how like EMDR has a protocol, the PIT work has a protocol, and you don't really mess with that, But as far as being able to educate clients on the model or giving over the basics of understanding that, I think you can find yourself as a therapist and how you relate to her model of treatment. So I think that's kind of formed how I treat clients. And I have made that more personal to me. And I think that's where I came to the needs and unmet needs, because she does talk a lot about being able to meet our unmet needs and either being boundaryless or walled off. So if I'm boundaryless, I just think that all of my needs need to be met all the time. Whereas if I'm walled off, maybe I become needless and wantless. And for on both ends of the spectrum, that takes some psychoeducation and a client being willing to get to know what a need really is or what a want is, and feeling like they're allowed to have needs and wants, even that it doesn't violate their. I see for clients who are needless and wantless, it feels like they're going to violate other people's needs or wants if they have some. Whereas people who are boundaryless, typically we're not given proper limits on their needs and wants, or don't know or feel fearful that they won't be taken care of. So I feel entitled to my needs being met. So that education on what's really a need, what's really a want, and what are the appropriate boundaries around needs and wants. What's somebody else's job to care for me versus my own responsibility to care for myself. I might be overcomplicating it, but
No, I appreciate that. That's really interesting. If I'm remembering right, you're a supervisor, is that right?
Yeah. So I'm a qualified supervisor for mental health counseling as well as marriage and family therapy, and just recently I'm working on my CSAT supervision.
No, great.
Yeah.
Curious, as a supervisor, I know we have some younger therapists listening, but I also, helpful for therapists of all tenure. What advice do you have for newer therapists or just therapists in general? You've been in the field for a while. What do you think is an important message for our therapists who are listening?
I think it's twofold. I think these two interact with each other. One is to seek additional training that is comprehensive in addressing the therapist's role in the training. I think we can go to trainings and we learn all the theory or the practice or the application of it, but it's not bringing us to our own healing place or our own further depth of understanding of ourselves. Whereas some trainings, I did a brain spotting training a couple years ago, and that was one that sticks out to me. The CSAT training is one that sticks out to me. Somatic training sticks out to me as being these trainings that really bring us closer to the understanding of ourselves. The IFS training is that way. You're asked to do your own personal work, and that would be the second thing about what I would advise for therapists is doing our own work, and for many reasons. One, because we can really only go as deep with a client as we understand ourselves. I'm not going to be able to go further with a client than I've gone with myself emotionally or somatically or in nurturing them. If I haven't given that nurturing to myself, there's going to be part of me that is afraid of the things in them that I haven't dealt with for myself. So there's that piece of how we treat clients, and then also doing our own work because of burnout. That's something that I think during COVID really impacted me as a therapist. And while my work didn't suffer with my clients, I think all of us, but I can speak from my own experience. I felt the impact of the isolation of COVID. I also ended up having 2 small children during COVID, so it's amazing. I love my life, but it's a lot all at once, and it's a lot in a world that was very uncertain at the time. And so I think there was much more burnout for me than if we were still in person with therapists and clients in the office, or we were still in person with our support groups, or even just going to the grocery store, seeing people. I went and saw a play with some friends the other night, and we were all like, oh, this is so nice. It's like you can breathe. It's like normal. And during the stress of the last few years, like all of us have been impacted by that. And if we're going back to that polyvagal theory, nervous system response to that type of environment, I'm going to be in a more fight, flight, or freeze, or anxious or numb state to cope with just the adversity that we went through as a country and individually. So our personal work and trainings that bring us closer to finding ourselves, I think, are the 2 things that are really important for us as therapists to do.
Absolutely. What you talked about, just going to a grocery store during the pandemic, the loneliness. I think we all isolation experience that on different levels. Other than going out and being with people, what did you find personally was helpful with the loneliness and the isolation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I engaged in my own healing process. I joined group therapy and utilized the telehealth platform that all of my clients were benefiting from telehealth.
Yeah.
I let myself benefit from it also. So I was able to join a telehealth group and address some of the postpartum changes that I went through in the time. So utilizing the online support community, as well as going outside. Sunshine was a huge piece of that. I mean, we briefly kind of touched on wellness, and I have the benefit of living in Florida. And so I was outside every day. And I think that was one of the fun things about the pandemic, was like there was so much time for new activities and being outside, and it became like crucial. And it was almost like hoping to go outside to see all the other people walking, like just
Yeah.
the connection of that. And what that did for me is continued for me my basics of self-care, which is getting outside, physical exercise, drinking water, doing the basics, going to groups as I need, I reaching out, creating community, because it became harder to have community for many reasons, like I said, because of the COVID pandemic, as well as new motherhood. And I had to be really intentional about creating support systems. And that was also when I actually chose to do my brain spotting training, which was part of a conscious choice of not only furthering my education as a therapist, but because I felt like it would give me some tools to deal with what I was going through and coping with that, which it did. And finding a new community to be part of, utilizing my current communities. The CSAT community is an amazing group of people. The therapists in South Florida are amazing, and I am lucky to have some really good network down here. So I had to utilize my that 500-pound phone, and get really strong at working that muscle and picking that up.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing all that, Faith. And it's I think everything you shared, was very necessary for you during the pandemic. But I think like all those pieces you shared would be helpful for just about anyone outside the pandemic. And I think a lot of us are still dealing with loneliness and isolation. I mean, our society has completely changed, and we're still dealing with the ripple effects of that period of loss and isolation. And I love that you take your health and wellness into your own hands and keep taking those steps to create that support for yourself. You practice what you preach, and that's so, and then that allows you to give better services to your clients.
Yeah, one of the things I preach to clients is the importance of having integrity. Like recovery is coming back to a place of integrity, and integrity really, it doesn't mean, again, moral high ground or superiority. Integrity means wholeness, and wholeness means who I am, what I say, how I act, what I feel are congruent. And while I'm not going to go to a client and talk about my personal life, or I'm not going to go to the bank teller and ask them for advice on my marriage, like I am going to be authentic and genuine in an appropriate way in the appropriate context, and that's having integrity. So integrity requires boundaries and vulnerability, and you can't do that without, again, like you said, practicing what you preach.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I have a lot of empathy for the therapists that are silently suffering or are in pain or feel like they have to maintain a perfectionism or a one-up position from their clients. Us therapists don't get into the field because we're perfect people. We get into the field because we're wounded healers, and I think sometimes we forget that, or we haven't done the work that's necessary for us to have the compassion with ourselves to be human and care for ourselves. And yeah, for any therapist that is ever suffering, I have a huge heart for, because we are not supposed to be perfect. And yeah. If anybody is suffering out there and as a therapist, like you have permission to do your own work.
No, that's a great message. And I did want to track back to that piece on getting outside. I am biased because I've spent a lot of time out in the wilderness, and it's brought me so much clarity and peace and connection in my life. And so I'm a huge advocate of eco therapy, connecting people through experiences, if possible, with plants or guided imagery to connect with natural systems. But, even something like the sunlight, I've been listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast, the Huberman Lab. Awesome. And he does like our podcast talking about the scientific literature on sunlight exposure and how important it is to get outside first thing in the morning, as soon as you can, and get at least 20 minutes of sunlight exposure. Actually, he recommends you get this app on your phone. They have a free app, and it's LUX. It measures the luxes, so that's the measurement of how bright light is. And I got it. I was measuring the lights in our home. They're about like 100 to 150, and then I go outside. I live in Oregon too. It's a colder, overcast day, and I was shining it up in the sky, and it was like 13,000 lux. So
Wow.
it gives our bodies these signals that are part of our circadian rhythm. It gives us energy, gets us going throughout the day. So I love that that's was part of your routine during COVID, and I'd encourage anyone who can fit that practice into their lives and encourage their clients to do so, to do that, because it really has, like, our bodies evolved outside, not inside. And so I think it's quite challenging on multiple levels for our bodies to be cooped up inside all day. So just wanted to reiterate that, because I don't think that's much of a conversation in the psychotherapy world.
I there's two things. First is I always know I'm in the right place, because like these same themes will keep coming up, and if I can't count how many times I've talked about Huberman in the last month.
Oh, awesome.
And so when you brought him up, I'm like, here's the universe just like giving me a clue. I'm in the right place, obviously.
Awesome.
And he's really brilliant. And I think like I said, there's a lot of podcasters that are doing really great work. The Rich Roll podcast, I think, is really amazing for people in recovery. Although he's more fitness minded, he's more about like ultra marathon sports. I think he talks about the depth and breadth of the recovery, of what's available for whole recovery. He recently had a podcast with Dr. Gabor Mate that was really amazing. And I recommend that to a lot of clients. But we have so many amazing resources. It just feels like that's very exciting to me that we have the power to really educate ourselves on health. And so that was one comment I had. The other thing is I remember years ago learning from a mentor who was just a healer, and not more than just a therapist. She was a healer of people, and she would say, if a client is suffering from depression, ask them to go sit outside wearing orange and eating oranges, or wearing yellow and eating oranges. And I was like, what? Okay. And until you do it, it sounds just like the most ridiculous thing, but there's so many different things going on there. One, vitamin C helps the absorption of vitamin D in the body. So you're getting the benefit of being outside, and the mood elevation, the norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin that's increased by being in nature, plus the vitamin D, which is helps to facilitate proper brain function, which gets us out of depression. And then the vitamin C, the orange, the smell, the aromatherapy of it, and then the color, the sunshiny bright, what it's cueing for our brain. And so I think we're in a really amazing time where the things that used to seem very silly and, like maybe energy work or energy healing and out there type of practices, we have all the science to back it. Like maybe one day we'll find God in science. I'm not sure, but we're closer than ever to seeing the power of the universe in practice through scientific application. And I just think it's a really beautiful time to be somebody who's in the healing profession because of that. So that's a separate tangent from sex addiction and recovery.
Yeah.
Kind of separate, but not totally, because there's that idea that we're like glorified houseplants. We need in order to survive, we need hydration, respiration, sunlight, kind words, fresh soil. And all of those things contribute to the quality of our lives and our recovery. Whereas if I'm hiding in a dark closet with crappy air and I'm getting fed alcohol and I'm never getting a kind word, I'm not going to thrive in that environment. And the houseplant that I picture in the closet is like the person trying to find love in a club or online alone. And so when you give a sex addict sunlight and air and good soil and kind words, they thrive and grow. And I think that's not just exclusive to people in recovery from sex or love addiction. I think that's humans as a whole.
Yeah.
Need that type of care.
No, I think you're right. And I'm going to have to try to eat an orange out in the sun with a yellow shirt in the near future. So thanks for that recommendation. That sounds nice. We're about at the end of the hour here. Before I ask the last question, I generally ask guests, could you give our listeners a bit of your contact information? Where can they find your work?
Yeah, so our practice is located in Boca Raton, Florida. The name of our practice is Lionhearted Counseling. Our Instagram is @Lionhearted Counseling. We also have a website, which is www.lionheartedcounseling.com. We currently have a staff of myself as well as 3 other therapists. And at this time, we're really focusing and I'm focusing and specializing on doing more intensive work in order to balance my life as well as my current caseload. It's not practical for me to take new clients, but I love doing that intensive model of one-on-one individual work, which could typically last for a day, 2 days, depending on the client need. And then we also have a wonderful team that has availability to book, and we all collaborate as a group. And I'm lucky to have really skilled clinicians that I get to spend my days with and collaborate with. And so if for some reason we don't have a fit for you on our staff, we'll make sure to refer out to a clinician that fits your needs. So it's another thing that I think is really important as therapists, is that it's not just about being able to take every client or meet every client's needs. If we don't have what they need, we refer out to the best source possible.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And your website, I visited already. It's a great website. And if you're interested in all at looking at the intensive, there's more information there. And I take it people travel from all around the country to go to the intensive.
Yeah, typically most of my clients are living out of state at this point. It's just the way the cookie crumbled, and thank God for virtual health and access over the internet, I think that people that typically wouldn't be getting care are able to and find us through social media or web presence, and are able to use telehealth to do the onboarding process and then fly in or stay in the area for the intensive, either 1 to 2 day intensive.
That's great. And I believe in the intensive model. I think it's such a great way to just, get down with a skilled clinician like you and really make some significant shifts in your life. So highly recommend that. The question I like to ask guests at the end is, what's the message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
Oh, that there's no limit to a person's ability to heal, regardless of the pain or fear or depth of addiction that they've been in, that with the right help and with the right care and their own commitment to the process, that there is no limit to the healing that they can achieve. I have a lot of clients who have started off feeling like they were hopeless or empty or broken or lacked what it was that made them essentially as human as other people. And that is not true. We are innately valuable, and we are whole at our deepest core, true self. And through the process of recovery and a commitment to that pretty much anybody can find healing. There are severe and persistent things that might not be my specialty, but I still believe in the ability for a human to heal.
A beautiful message to end with. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today, Faith.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.